Driving isn't just a way to get from point A to point B, it's a way of life. Some people find peace at the beach, others in the quiet hum of a library. But for me, true serenity is found on the open road at 2 a.m., the vast stretch of asphalt illuminated only by my truck's headlights. I was born into this life. My father was a trucker, and he taught me everything he knew, how to trust my instincts, how to navigate without fancy gadgets, and most importantly, how to respect the road. For 23 years, I'd never needed a GPS. I'd never gotten lost until last night. I was hauling farming equipment through Kentucky, a route I knew like the back of my hand. The sun had been relentless all day, the heat so thick it turned the horizon into a shimmering mirage. But as night fell, the world cooled, and I found my rhythm. The highway stretched endlessly before me, empty and quiet. This was my sanctuary. Then, just as I crested a hill, I saw them, flashing construction signs and the angry red glare of brake lights. Traffic was at a standstill. Nothing boils my blood like stop-and-go congestion, especially in a big rig. But then, as if summoned by my frustration, I spotted a side road, narrow, unmarked, barely noticeable, but it was there. Most drivers would hesitate, but I wasn't most drivers. I trusted my instincts. I made the turn, leaving the gridlock behind. The road was tight, winding through a dense forest, its trees stretching their limbs overhead, forming a tunnel of shadow and moonlight. I slowed down. Hitting a deer in a truck like mine would be catastrophic. The deeper I drove, the more I noticed how unnatural the silence was. No owls, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects. Just silence, heavy, unsettling. Then I saw it, a gnarled tree on the left side of the road, its bark twisted and blackened, its branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept driving. The road had to lead somewhere. 20 minutes later, the same tree appeared again. I knew it was impossible. Trees could look similar, sure, but this one, this grotesque, contorted thing, was unmistakable. I pushed forward, gripping the wheel tighter. Another 20 minutes. There it was again, this time on my right. The wind rustled through its branches, making them quiver, as if reaching for me. My foot pressed harder on the gas. I don't know how long I drove before I saw headlights in the distance. Another truck. Relief washed over me. I honked, flashing my lights in the Universal Trucker's SOS. No response. I honked again. Nothing. That was when I noticed the license plate. The last 4 digits were identical to mine. My relief turned to ice. My truck's engine roared as I tried to catch up, to get a closer look. But in an instant, the other truck was gone, vanished. The road it had been on, gone, as if it had never existed. The radio crackled to life, static filling the cab. I twisted the dial, searching for anything, any sign of civilization. The static gave way to something strange, music, faint, distorted, but unmistakable. Jingle bells! In May, that's when I saw the snow, a patch of white piled high in the middle of a swampy ditch. My hands went numb on the wheel. This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. I slowed down, reaching for the door handle. I needed to see, needed to touch it, to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. A shadow moved past my window. I froze. My breath hitched. I snapped my head to the side, expecting to see an animal, maybe a deer, but there was nothing, just darkness, and the snow was gone. I slammed the door shut, my pulse hammering. I needed out. I needed the highway. I broke my lifelong rule and switched on the GPS. The screen flickered, searching for my location. Then it loaded. A blank map. No roads, no markers, just a black void. I drove faster. The radio static turned into whispers. Low, murmuring voices that I couldn't quite make out. Shapes moved in the thickening fog. My GPS flickered wildly, showing locations that made no sense. Western Europe, Nebraska, Australia, none of it was real. The road ended abruptly. I slammed the brakes, my rig screeching to a halt mere inches from the jagged trees that blocked my path. The fog swirled around me, thick as smoke, curling against my windshield like grasping fingers. Then through the haze, I saw it. A figure, tall, motionless, its form cloaked in shifting darkness, absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. It stood just beyond the trees, watching. The whispers grew louder. Then it moved. Not walked, glided, closer, closer. The voice on the radio hissed, crystal clear now, whispering my name. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the wheel until my knuckles went white. "It's not real," I whispered. "It's not real. It's not real." A sharp scrape against my window. I screamed, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was parked at the edge of a quiet highway, the golden arches of a McDonald's glowing in the distance. My radio played country music. My GPS read that I was only 5 miles from my drop-off point. I checked the time. I should have still been hours away. Shaking, I stumbled into the restaurant, barely aware of my own movements. I needed something: coffee, food, anything to ground me. I splashed water on my face in the bathroom, hoping the cold would snap me out of whatever hallucination had gripped me. Then I saw my reflection. I dropped my coffee. The man staring back at me wasn't the same one who had taken the detour. My hair, once salt and pepper, was completely grey. My skin, once firm, was lined with wrinkles, my hands spotted with age. In the span of a single night, I had aged 15 years. I don't know what I encountered out there. I don't know where I went or how I came back. But I do know this: I will never take another unknown road again. To any driver reading this, hear me now. Stay on the highway. Stay on the path. Some roads weren't meant to be traveled. Master Sergeant Oscar Green Jr. had always been a fan of Southern rock. There was something about the rough, gritty sound of it that made the miles on a long, quiet road bearable. Tonight, though, it felt different. The roar of the guitars was louder, the beat more intense, as if the music was pushing him to go faster, to keep moving forward. Y'all, that was It's All Over Now by Molly Hatchet. Ain't nothing like good old Southern rock to take the edge off a stormy Sunday night. This is Sammy James, and I'll be riding with you till the cows come home here on 95.3 Rebel Country. Stay tuned, because up next, we've got the Outlaws, a full throttle, 3-guitar attack. Y'all hold on tight as we travel the Devil's Road together. Oscar cranked up the volume, letting Freddie Salem's shredding riffs fill the interior of his Ford F-150. The music vibrated through him, the sharp, crackling rhythm quickening his pulse. He let his head bob along with the beat, his knee tapping the floor in time, his fingers rhythmically drumming against the steering wheel. It was a much-needed release, especially after the miserable last couple of hours. He should have been home hours ago. His drill weekend had ended hours earlier, but now here he was, creeping down some back road in Tennessee, trying to get back to his house, some 67 miles away. The mess on E24 had been a nightmare, a 9-car pileup that trapped him in standstill traffic for 45 minutes. Impatient, he had decided to take the rural route home, a decision he regretted as soon as he turned onto the isolated country road. The air around him was thick with anticipation, as if something unseen was lurking just outside his headlights. The heavy, looming clouds above swallowed what little light the full moon might have provided. The road stretched endlessly ahead, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt that seemed to stretch forever through the dark, uninviting landscape. A deep rumble of thunder echoed in the sky. The storm was still holding off, but Oscar knew it wouldn't be long. His eyes flicked nervously toward the storm clouds, his hands tightening on the wheel. He hated driving at night. And he hated driving at night in storms even more. Every lightning strike seemed to spark something inside him, sending waves of unease crashing through his chest. His heart raced in sync with the thunder, his breathing shallow and quick. Sweat beaded along his forehead and trickled into his eyes. It was like something was out there, waiting. Oscar couldn't explain why, but the isolation of the road seemed to amplify his growing dread. There had been no other cars for miles, no houses, nothing but dark silhouettes of trees and overgrown fields. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't go out at night," his father would warn, his gravelly tone heavy with conviction. "Wickedness doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it's disguised in plain sight." Oscar shook the thought away, telling himself that it was just the storm messing with his mind. "Just effing wonderful," he muttered under his breath, as the radio cut out abruptly, the song replaced by static. With a frustrated grunt, he began fiddling with the radio controls, trying to find a station that wasn't a mess of interference. Nothing. It was as though the world had gone silent, the silence pressing in around him like a suffocating blanket. Even his phone was dead. No bars, no connection. It wasn't the first time his gadgets had betrayed him, but tonight, in this desolate stretch of road, the isolation felt heavier, more oppressive. Oscar shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. "Just focus. You can do this," he muttered aloud, his voice weak against the mounting tension. Only 54 miles to go. If the weather held out, he could make it home soon. But that's when the rain started. It was light at first, just a few drops. Then it turned into a steady drizzle, each raindrop hitting the windshield like a tiny hammer, its rhythm driving him to the edge of madness. Oscar switched on the wipers, but the sound of the rain against the glass never let up, like a constant, nagging presence trying to push him into the storm's embrace. It was then he saw them, two figures just off the side of the road. At first, they seemed like shadows, distant and blurry in the rain-soaked night. But as he got closer, he could see them more clearly. Two people walking slowly along the side of the road, their faces barely visible through the downpour. Oscar instinctively slowed down, curious. Who were they? Why were they out here, on this empty road, at this hour? Then something strange happened. The taller of the two, he couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, stopped and turned, raising one hand, the unmistakable gesture of a hitchhiker. A shiver ran down Oscar's spine. For a brief moment he felt a pull, something almost hypnotic. His hand instinctively moved toward the steering wheel, and he found himself easing the truck toward the side of the road. The need to help, to offer a lift, surged through him, an overwhelming, almost magnetic urge. But then the clarity came crashing back. What was he thinking? Picking up strangers in the middle of nowhere, at night, during a storm? Number that wasn't safe. His father's warning echoed louder in his mind, and with a quick twist of the wheel, Oscar swerved around them, never making eye contact, never slowing down. For a few minutes, he breathed easier. That was the right choice. Except, as he glanced into the rearview mirror, he saw them again. The figures were still there, standing in the same spot, watching him drive away. Oscar's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. Something didn't feel right. He tried to shake the unease, but it was like a weight pressing against his chest. Every mile he put between himself and the hitchhikers only seemed to intensify the feeling that something was following him. And then, as if on cue, he saw the gas gauge light up, low fuel. "Son of a bitch," he cursed. The universe seemed to be mocking him tonight. Oscar scanned the road ahead, looking for any sign of a gas station. It was already past midnight, and he was in the middle of nowhere. Then, just as hope seemed to fade, he saw it. A small filling station up ahead. The relief was short-lived. As he pulled in, the station's lights flickered ominously above him. The heavy rain was now a full-on downpour, drowning the world in a deafening roar. Oscar stepped out of the truck, his boots slapping against the wet pavement. The storm was relentless now, the wind howling through the empty lot. Then, just as he began pumping the gas, the lights flickered again, the shadows around him deepening and stretching as if alive. Oscar froze. His instincts screamed at him to move, but before he could, the lights above him exploded in a shower of glass, plunging him into total darkness. And then he saw them, the figures. They were standing across the street, watching. Oscar's heart thundered in his chest as he scrambled to finish pumping the gas, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The panic that had been building all night now surged to the surface. Without thinking, he shoved the nozzle back into place and bolted toward his truck. The storm continued to rage around him, but it was the two figures that consumed his mind now. They crossed the street slowly, deliberately, and came closer. Closer to him. His fingers fumbled with the keys, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. And then, the worst thing happened. One of the figures, no, one of the teenagers, was standing right at his window. His face was pale, his eyes cold and distant. The boy raised a hand and knocked once. Knock, knock, knock. Oscar's blood turned to ice. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The voice that came from the boy's mouth was hoarse, drawn out, as if it didn't belong to a teenager at all. "Can you give us a ride?" the boy asked, his voice chillingly polite. "We missed the bus, and we don't have anywhere else to go." Oscar's throat tightened. His eyes locked onto the boy's face. But there was something wrong with him, something terribly wrong. The boy's eyes were hollow, black, empty, like two bottomless pits sucking in all the light around them. Oscar recoiled, his hand trembling as he reached for the door handle. But before he could close it, the boy's hand slammed down on the window. The smile, the twisted, inhuman grin, stretched wide. Oscar screamed. The truck roared to life as he slammed his foot on the gas, tearing out of the station without a second thought. His heart was pounding in his chest, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. 40 miles of highway later, he finally reached home. He didn't park in the driveway. Instead, he drove straight onto the lawn, barely stopping before leaping out of the truck. His door was left wide open as he sprinted to the front door, locking it behind him and securing it with a chair. But when he turned around, he saw them. Two figures standing at the edge of his driveway, watching. In the middle of nowhere, beneath a sky veiled in darkness and alien stars, there lies a crossroads. The roads, composed of jagged rocks and dry dirt, stretch into infinity, their paths uncertain. Each step taken upon them stirs the dust, sending it swirling into the frigid air. The brittle, lifeless grass at the edges blurs the boundary between road and desolate wilderness. There is no sound here. Nothing but the echoes you bring with you. At the northeast corner, a forgotten cemetery slumbers. The wooden markers, once bearing names, have long since crumbled, their inscriptions lost to time. The bones beneath the parched earth belong to souls unremembered, their identities erased. They have been anonymous longer than any of us have lived, and they will remain so long after we join them beneath the soil. To the northwest, barely visible in the murk, lies a path, once well-trodden, now overtaken by decay, leading to a ruined farmhouse at the heart of an abandoned field. The family that built it had once basked in the triumph of its creation. Their laughter had filled the rooms, their love had warmed the walls. But the walls had not been strong enough to hold back the horror. They bore witness to suffering, soaked up the screams that went unanswered, and became slick with blood and gore. When the family fell silent, the house was left to rot. Now its skeletal remains leer over the crossroads like a gaping, malformed skull. The other two corners hold fields that stretch beyond the limits of sight. But there is no life in these fields, only vast expanses of brittle yellow stalks, remnants of something that once grew, now long dead. And the roads? They lead everywhere, they lead nowhere. A young woman once stumbled out of a dingy Chicago apartment, her breath hitching, her pulse frantic. Red stains marred the fabric of her dress. Her veins burned with a toxic cocktail of narcotics, her mind a storm of panic and regret. She had done something she could never undo, something that ensured there was no path back to the life she had known. She fled into the night, disappearing beneath the rusting metal of a bridge. Less than an hour later, she was found dangling in the farmhouse ruins. A jagged splinter of timber from the ceiling had impaled her skull, protruding grotesquely from the back of her head. Her lifeless eyes gaped, her pale skin marred with deep, angry scratches. Blood dripped in thick rivulets from her ruined body, pooling beneath her, staining the wood as if the house itself were drinking her dry. There was a lawyer in Tallahassee, smug in his success. That day, he had walked out of the courthouse with a victory that lined his pockets. His client, a man whose crimes against children were too monstrous to name, walked free, untouched by justice, protected by legal maneuvering. The lawyer, unbothered by the truth, reveled in his skill, his brilliance, his reward. As he turned a corner, his fingers tapped against his phone screen, his mind lost in fantasies of how he'd spend his ill-gotten wealth. The phone was later found deep in the dead fields, its screen shattered, casing split. The lawyer was discovered sprawled on the westward path, his body twisted and sunken into the earth, as if the ground itself had tried to swallow him whole. One arm lay detached at his side, his briefcase clutched stubbornly in his remaining hand. Inside were the very documents that had secured his client's freedom, now smeared with the blood of their owner. In a Phoenix suburb, a man stormed from his home, rage coursing through his veins. His wife had screamed at him, had pointed at the swelling around her eye, had told him she was done. Done with his lies, his cheating, his wasteful spending. Done with the bruises he left on her and their daughters. Done letting him make excuses for the monster he had become. But he knew better. He wasn't the problem. She was the one turning their children against him. She was the one being unfaithful. He could feel it, even if he had no proof. And now, she wanted him gone so she could have everything for herself. She thought she had won. She hadn't. He'd have a few drinks, come back, and teach her a lesson. Maybe he'd teach the girls too. He knew just the thing in the garage, a heavy iron pry bar. That would remind them all who was in charge. But he never made it to the bar. He wandered into the crossroads instead, walking endlessly, his steps retracing themselves no matter which direction he turned. The fields swallowed his screams, the cold seeped into his bones. The farmhouse, empty and watching, gave him no shelter. The night never gave way to morning. Dehydrated, delirious, He collapsed among the nameless graves. He closed his eyes against the cold wind, his breath burning in his lungs. He never opened them again. I sit now at my desk, writing these words by the dim light of my study lamp. This house is my sanctuary, nestled far from prying eyes, far from the world that might ask too many questions. My study window overlooks my backyard, a sight that brings me great satisfaction. Rows of pine trees stand in precise formation, 6 to a row, the oldest furthest from the house. There are 3 full rows now, and I'm working on the 4th. Each tree is carefully tended, watered, and nourished. They flourish in the rich soil. 1 body per tree is all it takes. Nutrients seep from the decaying flesh beneath them, giving the trees their life, their strength. This morning, I awoke to the scent of damp, rotting grass in my nostrils. My bedroom, despite the summer heat outside, was unbearably cold. When I swung my legs over the bed and set my feet upon the floor, I felt the unmistakable crunch of dirt and stone beneath my soles. I know what this means. The crossroads has chosen me. It calls me to its endless roads, to its ruined house, to its silent graves. It beckons me to walk its paths, to become part of its hunger, to vanish into its eternity. It is an honor, in a way, a reckoning for the sins I have long accepted as my own. When the crossroads is done with me, when it has consumed what it needs, its hunger will return. It always does. And then it will choose again. Perhaps it will come for another monster like me. Perhaps it will take a dealer whose hands are stained with the deaths of addicts. Or maybe it will find someone like you. Are your hands clean? Do you sleep soundly? Or do your sins gnaw at the edges of your mind? Are you truly innocent? Or does your guilt fester in the dark corners of your soul? When the crossroads comes for you, will you be ready?